Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you are all having a wonderful Sunday. I'm Andrea Miller. I'm the founding board member for Center for Common Ground, and I am very pleased to welcome you to our COVID-19 and the 2020 Election Summit. Today, we are going to be talking about what is going to be possibly, for all the wrong reasons, the election of our lifetime. So again, thank you for joining us. So today is the second part of our summit. I'm going to start today, like I started yesterday, with a dedication to one of our phone bankers, Elaine Taylor, who passed away on May 14th. Elaine was not only one of our great phone bankers who could make 300 to 400 calls a day. Elaine was my baby sister. So Elaine, again, I dedicate this summit to you. Now, who is the Center for Common Ground? People who've heard this 9 million times, you're going to hear it 9,000,001. The Center for Common Ground is a Virginia-based 501c3, and we have a very simple mission. Our mission is to empower underrepresented voters. And we do that through two campaigns. The campaign that you are going to be seeing today is our anti-voter suppression campaign called Reclaim Our Vote. The other larger, more overarching campaign that we run is our Let Me Vote, Count My Vote campaign. And on the Count My Vote side, we frequently find ourselves suing boards of elections who refuse to understand it is their job to enhance democracy, not suppress it. In addition to having our mission for empowering underrepresented voters, we sort of accidentally ended up becoming a technology company courtesy of two of our board members who are co-founders of technology companies. And we build technology that helps us empower our underrepresented voters. So right now, I'm going to thank my board of directors. You've already met me. I'm the founding board member. So as Rodney says, this is all my fault. Reverend Rodney Sadler of the NAACP, Philip Thompson of the Virginia NAACP, Jesse Frierson, Virginia Alliance Against Mass Incarceration, Dr. Gabriela Limas, Mi Familia Vote, Bernard Simelton, Alabama NAACP, and then Deepak Puri and Pamela Thomas, co-founders of Dem Labs and Progressive Coders Network, and our newest board member, Katie Hornung of Equality Virginia. Now, the Center for Common Ground in 2020 is going to be doing electoral work supporting voters in 6 states. And as you can see, we picked 6 easy states: Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Texas. Now, what do? Well, we phone bank. And what I did since yesterday is I updated our numbers. We have, since January 4th, made 122,240 phone calls to our target states. We work on voter registration. And then when an election is imminent, we work on getting out the vote. We also send postcards. And I want you to notice our number. This is since January 4th. We have handwritten and mailed 1.4 million postcards to voters in voter suppression states. Most of our postcards have been voter registration postcards, letting people know that they have been dropped from the voter rolls and then giving them instructions as to how they can get back on. This last month, we have really concentrated on get out the vote in Georgia and vote by mail for over 65-year-olds in Texas. How do we know our postcards are effective? Well, we know they're very, very effective because we constantly get yelled at by state boards of elections, county registrars, and county boards of elections, at which point I simply remind them, your focus and your job is to ensure that your voters who want to vote are going to be able to vote. So I suggest take a moment and go and do your job, because if all the voters are calling you, that means they want to vote and they've got questions. So support your voters. This year was the first year that we have done postcards to such a large scale. So little did we know when we commissioned a local Virginia artist to design our postcards how true the one in the middle would be. In 2020, we are indeed voting for our lives. And then we are voting for our lives so that we can get our underrepresented voters to understand their power and vote their power. And so that we, the people, can truly have power to the people. Now, our speakers today, Dr. Gabriela Lemus will be our moderator. Dolores Huerta will give our keynote. We will have Natasha Mercer, Phaedra Jackson, and Stephen Rosenfeld, and Thomas Saenz as guests that will be part of an incredible panel this afternoon. So I'm going to thank you right now and say, Gabby, take it away.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate this introduction, and more than anything, I am grateful that you allow me to play with you guys at Center for Common Ground, because this work that they are doing is the real deal. They make it happen. And so many of us who have been in this space for many years, we rely on our volunteers and our grassroots members. But what I love is this idea of connecting the technology to help these voters who may have digital divide issues by virtue of using your cell phone, for example, doing texting. It's alternative ways of improving their access to the vote. So welcome to day 2. To our Reclaim Our Vote Grassroots Summit series. And again, to those of you who joined us yesterday, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us today. And those newbies who have just joined us, thank you for doing so. We really appreciate it. I just want to recognize, before we get really rolling on voting, it's just what a difficult time we're going through. And I also want to raise up how important it is that we stay focused in our effort to keep our democracy strong. If we've seen anything in the just over this weekend, is just how insane it is. You know, and like I said yesterday, when we first envisioned this event 2 months ago, we were still in the very early throes of COVID-19. And with alarm, as the same as with all of you, we watched how quickly the infection numbers and the deaths were adding up. But at that time, the focus was still bi-coastal. It was still about California and Washington and New York and the tragedy there, and New Jersey and Massachusetts. Primaries were also in full swing, and it was clear that voting in person was going to be problematic. And what we saw is state after state started to re-examine or examine their process, maybe for the first time even. And some states like mine in Maryland, no problem. We delayed our vote, we delayed our primaries, and the governor just sent everybody ballots by mail. But some, like Wisconsin, pushed forward and forced people to go to the polls in person and stood in line, and so many became ill. So obviously this is something we still will have to think about in November. So fast forward to today, and what are we seeing? There are over 103,000 dead. The economy is tanking. Maybe the stock market is doing well, but the rest of it, not so great. Unemployment through the roof. And sadly, what's upsetting and will concern us is that we're going to start witnessing the displacement of people, particularly renters, as they lose their home, which will have an impact on their voting status, and maybe even their desire to go to the polls. So to move the economy along, what have we seen? States are now reopening, yet there's still little guidance on the most appropriate way to do so. There's still no widely available tests, and where there are tests, there are still some discrepancies. So we're not really sure if the data is accurate. PPE is still lacking in many hospitals, and since reopening started, now we have new hotspots in places where we work: North Carolina, Alabama, Virginia, Iowa, Wisconsin, Arkansas. We're also seeing select rural spaces in California, like Sonoma. Rural areas and smaller metropolises are now beginning to be hit harder. I think that's going to continue and progress if what we've witnessed in our own states is any evidence. Racism has sprung out of the closet. In the last few weeks, we have witnessed 3 horrible, horrible, and needless murders: Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And because of their deaths and how poorly it was handled by the authorities, Friday night, the country exploded. It exploded again yesterday. There have been riots and protests recorded in at least 30 cities that I am up to snuff on across the country. And now I think what we're also seeing is that there is more confusion and violence, as allegedly outsiders are starting to drive into these states to create additional harm. So I don't mean to sound like a worrywart, but when I think about voting, what if we start seeing outside agitators trying to create more confusion in that situation as well? So people's nerves are fraying. You know, to quote Martin Luther King, riots don't develop out of thin air. What he knew, and we see today, is that as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the condition of having riots over and over again. And these conditions must be condemned as rigorously as the riots themselves. What that tells us is that social justice and full, meaningful enfranchisement equals riot prevention. We also know that when something is burned down or destroyed, we have to build it back again, and something will replace it, right? Vacuums are always must be filled. So the question is, for all of us, what are we going to fill this with? How do we turn this horrible moment in history into something positive, an opportunity for a better democracy, a stronger, a more just and equitable society? As this is a nation, we need a do-over. The only way we're going to get that do-over is with an election. And that's why we're doing this today, to ensure that the process is free and fair. So yesterday, we discussed the what of the current historical moment, what is happening, what we need to understand in the big picture. Today, we're going to discuss more of the how. And once again, we're going to try to answer the hard questions. Can we as citizens stand up and fight back? And that big question, how do we do so? How do we reclaim our vote to strengthen our democracy? And let's not forget, once we do show up and let's say our candidates get elected, that's just the first step. We still face an uphill climb. Damage to repair is no longer just physical damage. It requires a real shift in culture. And, you know, beginning to accept that that's where we're headed. So with that hopeful note, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dolores Huerta, our keynote, who has so graciously joined us at her 90th birthday weekend. I want to share a little tiny short personal story. When I first met Dolores, I was at the League of United Latin American Citizens. And I have to tell you, I was odd. And I was also very awkward. But in her incredible Dolores fashion, she didn't even blink. She embraced what I was trying to do in my new role as an activist. And she mentored me without ever saying a word. So thank you, Dolores. I'm always going to be grateful for that. So please welcome Dolores Huerta, longtime advocate for the voiceless and instigators of very, very good fights. Dolores.
Thank you very much, Gabby. And I want to thank everybody for having me be part of this very, very important the session that you're having today, because when we see everything that's going on around us and we think, oh my God, what can we do? What can we do? How can we address all of these issues? We know that the pandemic has shot the spotlight on so many things that have to be corrected. And I just want to say, you know, we have to, in a way, we have to say to all the protesters out there that we understand what they're doing. I personally could not join a protest. I'm still on lockdown like many of you. Mm-hmm. My grandchildren were out there protesting, and we have to thank them for that in many ways, for bringing those voices. We do know that we have to do more in terms of saying to the police, you have to really help the protesters, not attack them. We have to help them because protesting is, of course, a civil right that we have under our Constitution of the United States of America. But we know that these protests have to be managed, that they have to be organized in such a way so that other innocent people are not getting killed in the process. But they definitely are bringing attention to the things that need to be fixed. And when we say that, and when we do our outreach to get people to register to vote, this is what the connection that we have to make. You know, one of the things that I've learned in my, 60 years of activism, because I started well, actually 70 years now, because I started when I was in my 20s. The one thing that I learned is that you have to connect the vote with legislation, because so many people out there, they don't realize that when you vote, you're actually going to have a really tragic and a tangible, not tragic, you're going to have a tangible result for your participation in voting. Way back when I was in my 20s and as a lobbyist and a political director for the Community Service Organization, which was the organization that Cesar Chavez and I first got involved in, the gentleman that taught us, and many of you may know of him, many of you may not. He's such a great organizer that nobody knows who he is. His name was Fred Ross Sr. Fred Ross had been involved in the down there in Orange County, California, when they had Mexican kids segregated in schools from the white kids, and he organized the parents to be able to desegregate the schools and to file lawsuits, and he ended that segregation. So the thing that Fred taught us is that, yes, that we can make changes, but it does start with voting, and a lot of people just don't realize that. I started to say when I was a political director of the Community Service Organization, which was that group that we formed and that Fred Ross helped us organize. One of my first pieces of legislation that I passed in California was that people could register to vote. That sounds swell. What, really? Way back in 1963, and I like to really talk about this, especially when I go to Texas, okay? Because before in California, they had the same voting procedures that you have in Texas, but you couldn't register to vote unless you found a deputy that could register you. Well, we got rid of that way back in 1963. And every time I go to Texas and I say this to people over there, do you know that in California you can register at the, when you get your driver's license at the DMV, you can register to vote on your cell phone. Everybody can vote absentee, which we know is the big fight that's going on right now. And but as a result of that voter registration, we passed some really important legislation. One of the pieces that we were working on was that if you were a legal resident of the United States of America, if you had your green card, you could get public assistance. And that meant that you could get help for the aged, for the blind, for the disabled, aid to needy children. All of these benefits that had been denied to legal immigrants in the United States, we were able to attain. And I think that is our job as we go forward, because we have so much cynicism out there. So many people think, well, my vote doesn't matter. I don't matter. And so, when we talk about voter registration, I don't even like to use that word anymore. I like to use the word voter education, because we can register tons of people, but that doesn't mean that they're going to vote. And especially when it comes to our Latino community, and I think low-income communities, again, because they think their vote doesn't matter. And these are the votes that are absent in the work that we're doing. So we have to take the time, and it might take 10 minutes, it might take 15 minutes, 20 minutes to really take time with a potential voter and explain to them why it is important for them to vote, and tie it in with some piece of legislation that is going on right now. For instance, right now we know that in the Senate, they are not talking about the HEROES Act. They are talking about additional stimulus, additional funding to be able to come into our communities for the people that are currently in need because of the COVID virus. So this is a good time to talk to them. We can say to them that previous stimulus package, the CARES Act, you were able to get some of that money because, there are people here, our Democrats, they fought for that and they passed that. So now here we have this other HEROES package that is going to be in the Senate. And so when we talk to people, and by the way, we should also make this a priority for all of our lists, is to say to people, look, could you please pick up the phone and I guess when I say pick up the phone, it shows my age, right? But on your cell phone, call your senator, send them an email, tell them to please vote for the HEROES Act, and not to gut it, to make sure that funding really goes to where it should go, that it goes to the people in need. This pandemic has definitely put the spotlight on all of our areas of need, and we know what they are. I know everybody who's with us today knows exactly what they are. We're talking about our healthcare needs, the need for our children, the poverty that we have, the inequitable education, the prison reform that we need, so much, especially our communities of color. So we have a lot of content in terms of the conversations that we're going to be having with people. But the main thing is that we just have to convince them that they do matter and that they need to get out. They have to participate. You see behind me, I have the sign with the census on it, okay? Well, as you know, so many of our people, they have not yet participated in the census.
Yeah.
They have not even done that little simple 10-minute act of answering the questions that they need. And we say to them, please, do you realize, like in California, for instance, every one of us that gets counted, we bring in $2,500 into our community. If we don't participate, if we don't get counted, hey, that money's not going to come in. And we know that our opponents, the people that hate us, the Trump administration, they want our people to be invisible. And we have to convince them, you have to be visible. You have to be counted, because we are going to lose money for schools, for healthcare, for infrastructure, for parks, for streets, all of, for firefighters, all of this, services that we get through our taxes, we're going to lose that because you did not want to take the time to participate. So it's kind of helping to make people accountable and make them responsible. And once they understand that, I think that is what makes the difference. So when it comes to participating in the census, when it comes to registering to vote, and the other thing too, I think at this point, we don't want to say to people, we just want you to vote. No, we want you to commit to be an activist. We want you to come out here and help us get other people out to vote, get other people to register, help us to educate other people. And this is the way that we're going to do it, because we know that each one of us alone cannot make this happen. And I want to just talk a little bit too about the things that have been happening on the street. And this is why organization is so important. We know that the police out there, they should have been helping with the demonstrations to keep them civil. And I like to use an example as to why organizing is so important. In the United Farm Workers Movement, we had 5 people that were killed. We had 5 martyrs. 2 of them were killed within a 48-hour period. And one of them, Najee Daifala, was killed by a sheriff's deputy. There was no riots after that. Everybody fasted. We had a candlelight vigil. We had a huge, huge march of about 25,000 people, but there were no violent repercussions. And if, you know, this is why organization is so crucial and so important. So we have to continue to keep organizing. And I know so much of it has to be done virtually. And so we want to thank Andrea and all of you out there in the virtual world, which many of us are still trying to catch up on, you know, because you're ahead of the game, because somehow we have to continue organizing. It might be a little bit harder to do virtually, but I think it's a mandate that we have now, especially if we're going to try to win in November, that we have to continue to organize, organize, organize. And I think this is the way that we can actually make things happen, the changes that we need in legislation to make sure that all of these needs that we have in our community, that the resources are given to those needs. Oh, and that's the other thing. We have the time with the census. Tell people that this is how we get representation in the legislature, in the school board, and especially in the Congress. And for the Latino community, we have to emphasize, yeah, we're still trying to get immigration reform. You know, it's like we're 20 years late now. We should have been able to get that way back when we had those incredible big marches that we had back in 2006 and 2007. But there's still a chance, but we've got to get people elected, the people out there that will vote for immigration reform. And we're the only ones that can do it. So we have to, you know, not to give up. We can't give up. We've just got to keep working. I'm really happy to see all of the effects that have resulted from the work that Andrea and her group are doing. I was lucky to be in Virginia to be able to do some of that campaigning out there to see the wonderful results that came from those campaigns. And I actually use the state of Virginia as an example, especially in that election where the legislature remained red because of only one single vote. And so I use that example a lot just to explain to people how important it is that they vote. Just one last thing, you know, many times people say about the Latino community, why don't they vote? People get so frustrated. I like to say we have to invite them to vote. We have to invite them to vote. And I know some candidates don't like this when I say that, but you know, when voters that have never voted and they get a ballot, a big long ballot, and it's got all of these names on it and it's got propositions on it, and they kind of look at that and they kind of throw up their hands. I don't know these people, you know, what am I going to do? Well, we have to do more voter information to give to people, but also say to them, vote what you know. There's a saying in Spanish that says, no queremos quedar mal. We don't want to make a mistake. And so what they do is they just don't vote, okay? So no, we have to say you know, ask somebody, but if you're unsure about something, it's okay to leave it blank. The main thing is to vote for the presidency, for your congressman, for your senators, for your state legislatures, and ask people. So the work that we have to do, as I said before, it's not about voter registration. It's about voter education, and it's about getting people out to vote after we get them registered. So we know what we have to do out there, and I know I'm talking to the choir right now because all of us are on the same page.
I think Dolores dropped.
So I guess we then will move on to the next part of the program. Well, thank you, Dolores, even though you're not here. We hope you will rejoin us shortly. We are now going to begin our panel session. We are joined again by Tom Saenz, the President and General Counsel at MALDEF, Natasha, Senior Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Stephen Rosenfeld, Senior Fellow at the Independent Media Institute Voting Booth Project, and Phaedra Jackson. Phaedra, sorry, I don't have your title, but with Working America. For those of you who would like to see them, their speakers' bios are on our website at centerforcommonground.org, excuse me. So with that, I'd like to have each of you open up with a 5-minute presentation about the work you're doing. And I'll invite Tom to start first to talk a little bit about protecting voting rights, MALDEF's work, and especially how you've connected at MALDEF the voting work to the census work. That's so important to, as Dolores was saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. And I'm very pleased to join you all because of how important this election is. As you've already heard, I want to add one more reason, and that is the first thing that follows the United States Census, and it's critically important, as Dolores has already indicated, that we continue to make sure that every household is counted, and more important, that every person in every household is included in that count. The census does play a critical role in determining how we're represented in our legislative bodies. First and foremost, right after the census count is concluded, the census indicates how congressional seats, 435 members of the House of Representatives, will be redistributed among the states. It's critically important that our communities be counted because that can lead to increases in representation. For example, after the last census, the state of Texas, one of your target states, was the big winner. It gained 4 congressional seats as a result largely of the growth of the Latino and African American communities. Unfortunately, it was then put in the hands of a legislature that's hostile to representation of those 2 communities. And what we first saw after the census a decade ago was the creation of those 4 new seats, all of them to be represented by white conservatives. It took litigation filed by MALDEF and many others to challenge that configuration, and resulting in 2 of the 4 new seats being represented by an African American and a Latino in the Congress. So it does take sometimes additional fights, but the first step is to get the census count right. But the second step is to try to make sure that the line drawers are right as well. So this election is not only critical because we're electing a president, but also because we are electing legislators, governors, local officials, many of whom are still empowered to draw the lines for the next decade. Representation on city councils, school boards, county boards, state legislatures, and certainly Congress are largely determined by these line drawers. And we're electing many of them at this November's election. Another reason it's critical to participate in making sure that we get out the vote, that we get folks registered, and then everyone registered shows up and votes. Of course, in this pandemic, we face additional challenges in November with voting. It will be a public health concern for many people to go to the polls. We therefore must work today, months ahead of the November election, to try to increase the availability of remote voting options. First and foremost, that means trying to ensure that everyone who would like to has the right to receive a ballot by mail and to return their ballot by mail. There are a number of states around the country that don't require you to have a reason to request a ballot by mail, but there are unfortunately too many states, including the state of Texas, with which I am particularly aware because MALDEF was founded in Texas and still maintains one of our largest and most important offices there. The state of Texas requires you to meet a very narrow range of reasons in order to receive an absentee ballot. That means too many folks who would prefer to remote vote, to vote by mail, will be denied that right in the state of Texas. But there is still time to try to change what the state of Texas does, whether that's through congressional action or through action in the states, to ensure that everyone who would like to has a right to vote by mail. Of course, we know that for too many, particularly in the African American and Latino communities, voting by mail is not really an option for any number of reasons. First, too many within our community will require assistance in voting, and they will need that assistance by voting in person. Second, some folks in our communities, and we can all speculate as to why that might be, will not receive a ballot even if they request one, will not be mailed a ballot, and so we need to make the ability to vote in person an option for those folks. Third, there are some folks who understandably will not trust that their vote, once they mail it, will actually be counted, and they will desire to at least turn in their ballot in person, if not to vote in person. So consistent with public health guidelines, we still must make sure that the option of voting in person is widely available to ensure that we don't have long lines, huge crowds that would violate the kind of public health guidance we've received in this ongoing pandemic. So we need to make ample opportunity to vote, including the opportunity to vote early prior to an election, even on weekend days. The opportunity to vote ahead of the Tuesday of the election will make sure will help to make sure that there are not huge crowds violating public health guidelines at election places on election day. We also have to make sure that there are sufficient polling places left open. Even if majorities of folks ask for vote by mail options, we still have to make sure that there are ample, nearby, easily accessed places to vote in person. These are some of the challenges that we face in this particular election created by the pandemic. At the same time, we know that there are folks on the other side who are taking advantage of what we face to try to restrict the right to vote. We see a president who himself has voted by mail, now asserting that allowing more and more people to vote by mail would create fraud. Of course, he has absolutely no credibility on the issue of fraud, because we remember that in the last election, he asserted that millions of fraudulent voters are the only thing that prevented him from having a majority or plurality of the popular vote. Of course, it was far from true. There was absolutely no evidence today. In the last 50 years, there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud anywhere in the country, tied to vote by mail or tied to anything else. So these assertions that somehow making the option of voting by mail available broadly somehow will lead to voter fraud is the fraud that we have to prepare for and prepare to respond to. They are interested in preventing our people from voting by making these false assertions of fraud, and we must be prepared to combat them. We can work together to create laws at federal, state, and local level to ensure that the vote is readily available despite the pandemic and compliant with public health guidance. We can do that if we work together to ensure not only that everyone is registered, but that we change the laws to facilitate their participation, and that we ensure that everyone has the information they need. The simple fact is that too many of us lack familiarity with voting by mail and will need good instruction and education about how to do so effectively. So we have to make sure that folks have all the information they need and can take all of the steps necessary, particularly in the face of folks who don't want them to vote, to participate, to vote, and to make a real difference, not just in the November election, but for the reasons I mentioned earlier, in elections for the next 10 years as we look at redistricting in 2021 and 2022. I encourage all of us to participate in this endeavor, and together, I know we will prevail. Thank you, Gabby.
So I just talked a lot to myself. Okay, so you raised a lot of really important issues that I think we need to think about as collectively, which is especially this idea of more access to voting, earlier voting, et cetera. And I think that's something I hadn't personally considered as something to advocate on at my state level, but it makes sense. Because if we're going to avoid long lines and avoid what happened in Wisconsin, that actually is a very good advice. I will now invite Natasha, who will be joining us on behalf of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And Natasha, I'd like for you to also discuss the issue of protecting voting rights, but also what kind of critical steps do we need to take by November? If maybe you could address some of that from your perspective.
Good afternoon. Yes, I'm Natasha Merle. I'm here on behalf of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I'm here instead of Sherilyn Eiffel, and I saw in the chat a number of people were disappointed that Sherilyn can't be here today, but we've all seen kind of what's gone on in the news most recently with the protest of police brutality. And so just a couple of hours ago, Sherilyn had to turn her attention elsewhere. And so I have Gabby invited me to come instead, and so I'm happy to be here. Thank y'all for having me. Getting more directly to Gabby's points and questions, the current events have revealed, to some people at least, those who didn't already know, though I understand that most of us probably already recognize this, that our democracy is not working for large segments of this country. This includes barriers and laws that prevent citizens from participating in the political process that Tom really laid out just a moment ago. So contrary to what many people believe, though, what our nation is experiencing, this voter suppression, it is not an aberration. This is the same playbook that has been used in this country over and over. So even at this time, or perhaps especially at this time, during this pandemic, when the racial inequities and and the structural racism has become made even more clear, LDF continues to fight for the attainment of full citizenship of Black people. So in that vein, we at LDF, and myself included, have brought challenges in South Carolina, Alabama, and Louisiana. We've filed a brief in Texas as well, all challenging during the current pandemic, challenging to expand voters' ability to vote safely during this pandemic. So as Gabby mentioned, as we saw in Wisconsin just a few weeks ago, when voters were forced to congregate in person and to wait extremely long lines in order to vote, we saw that happen and we saw that play out on the TV. But, even if some voters are able to overcome the burden to their right to vote, or if they're first, willing to take that risk to vote in person during this time of COVID-19, that doesn't allow the states or does not justify states burdening the right to vote. And so, we saw what happened in Wisconsin, where after that happened, dozens of people tested positive for COVID-19. So at the Legal Defense Fund in Louisiana, for example, and in Texas, as Tom noted, in Louisiana, there's currently no excuse absentee voting. So people who face higher risk or consequences from COVID-19, which we now know also falls disproportionately on Black people, they don't allow voters to vote by mail without having a specific reason. And so people will either have to risk their lives or choose not to exercise their right to vote, which LDF is currently challenging. And even in states that do allow no excuse absentee voting, or states that have recently expanded their definitions to allow people who are concerned about COVID-19, that have allowed larger groups of people to vote absentee, we're still bringing challenges in those states because, the states may allow you to vote by mail, but there's other hurdles that voters have to overcome in order to vote by mail still. So for example, in Alabama, where we've brought this challenge, you may be able to vote by mail because of the COVID-19, but you have to, one, include a copy of your photo ID, and two, you have to have two witnesses sign your ballot, witness you signing your ballot, and also them themselves provide their signatures, or you have to get a notary. And so it doesn't make sense if you're truly concerned about COVID-19 in this pandemic, and you're concerned about people being able to safely vote and not wanting to force them to congregate and perhaps either endanger themselves or those around them. Why would you force people who don't have printers and scanners at home to go to some place to make a copy of their photo ID? Or why would you force them to find two people to witness their signature in person? That doesn't, comport with attempting to social distance and to keep voters safe. And it especially doesn't make sense in face of the fact that there's no legitimate interest for the states to continue to enforce these type of requirements. A number of states, obviously including Alabama, they say that they require a photo ID and they require getting two witnesses in order to prevent voter fraud. However, as you know, and as Tom had already laid out, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. And also, it's important that these states have other mechanisms already in place for preventing voter fraud, and that includes the criminal penalties they already have in place. So in Alabama, for example, there's already a subset of individuals who are allowed to vote by mail without providing a copy of their photo ID with their ballot. So there's no reasonable reason why the state's current laws that prevent voter fraud in those circumstances would not similarly prevent voter fraud now when people want to be able to vote by mail so that they can avoid risking contracting COVID-19 or passing it on to their communities. And so, voter fraud, which states and others use widely as a way to can continue voter suppression and continue to burden voters' right to access of the ballot. Waving the flag of voter fraud does not justify and cannot be allowed to justify burdening people's rights to access to the ballot. So, voters should not have to choose between serious risks to their health and their right to vote. And so that's why LDF, along with our pre-COVID-19 cases, have continued to file these other cases throughout the South to ensure that during this current pandemic, not just the November election, obviously we're looking ahead to the November election, but we also care very much about local elections. So there's local elections in South Carolina and Alabama in June, July, and August. And so we want to make sure voters who are voting in local elections are also protected and allowed to cast the ballot without risking their health. And so, even we're continuing to bring these challenges to ensure that voters don't have to make this, unnecessary and unconstitutional choice between the right to the ballot or risking the health of themselves and their communities. So thank you, Gabby, for inviting me and allowing me to join y'all at this, last minute.
Natasha, not at all. We're so happy to have you. So Phaedra, let me hand it over to you. Let's talk about what Working America has been doing. Y'all have some really interesting programs that really connect with voters. Perhaps you could share with us some of the on-the-ground critical steps that we should be thinking about and taking for November.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gabby, and thank you to the Center for Common Ground for having Working America be a part of this panel. Again, my name is Phaedra Jackson. I'm the Deputy Campaigns Director for Working America. For those of you who may not be as familiar with Working America, we are the community affiliate of the AFL-CIO, and so the body of work that we do is to organize folks who don't have access to a union on their job and organize them around social and economic equality. And so Working America is a nationwide organization. We've got about 3.5 million members throughout the country, many of them in the states that we are prioritizing here. So in Texas, in Georgia, in North Carolina, and Arizona, we're actually having conversations right now with those folks. And so the perspective that I really want to bring to this panel is just what we're learning. Working America is traditionally a boots on the ground, door-to-door canvas operation. We call ourselves the Canvas Marines, and our folks go out into communities and we're building relationships with folks like year round, right? And we were geared up to do that for 2020, and then COVID-19 happened, and we had to very quickly pivot and figure out how do we still have these conversations with voters in a meaningful and impactful way when we can't go and knock on their door and meet them at their doorstep. And so what Working America has done is really focused on a membership model that allows us to build these unique relationships based and centered on folks, the issues that they care the most about, and kind of connecting the dots with those issues and their participation civically. And so we wanted to figure out what are the best ways that we can do this. And one of the things we did very quickly was start to converse with folks just about COVID-19, right? How are people experiencing the impacts of COVID-19? We were able to identify a group of folks who were least likely to be practicing social distancing, least likely to be following guidelines. We had conversations with those folks. We did an actual clinical test. So we took a baseline of folks who we knew were most likely not practicing. We had conversations via text. We had two-way organizing conversations with folks, and we followed up to see which of those folks were really responding to that conversation. We then were able to measure that over 105,000 folks changed their behavior in regards to social distancing, and 300,000 folks started wearing face masks. And so what we want to take away from this is, how do we start to build that relationship, right? Like at some point, we will continue, we have a whole chain of communication in which we are conversing with these voters and having these conversations, But what we're finding is the most urgent need right now is to get access to information. We all know that folks there's no unified message coming nationally from our administration as to what folks should be doing in the wake of COVID-19. And so as we're able to build this relationship, as we're able to see measurable impacts on the conversations that we're having, we're then able to start to figure out how we can apply this same information in these same modes of contact and communication as we go through the 2020 electoral cycle. So how are we going to be able to use this information to make sure people know their rights when it comes to voting, to know their options when it comes to accessing a ballot by mail? And I want to say that to answer your question of what we should be doing now, the biggest thing is to start now, right? Like I said, Working America, we were geared up to put boots on the ground and knock on doors, and we had to just figure out what to do next. So start now, start talking to your members, start talking to the general public and figuring out what's the mode of communication and how you're going to be able to contact people, and then scale that to the scale we need if we're not able to go on the doors and talk to them face to face. Build and deepen your relationships with voters, right? So we're not really talking about elections right now, and voters don't really want to hear about elections right now. But what we are saying is, what is the most urgent need for you? For many voters, it's economic recovery and access to unemployment benefits. And so we've been directly connecting folks to information about how they can apply for unemployment insurance or how they can access healthcare because they've lost their jobs. And then, you know, the goal will be to talk to them about access to barriers at the ballot box and how those, connecting the dots so that they know how those issues in voting directly impact their lives. So thank you.
Thank you, Phaedra. So now I'll invite Steve to join us. And Steve, thank you so much. We'd like for you to tell us a little bit about absentee voting challenges and the work, obviously, you're doing through Voting Booth. And what do you think are the critical steps we should take by November?
Well, hi, thank you all. I really am honored to spend time with everybody here today. So yeah, I'm a national political reporter. I've been covering voting rights and voting technology issues since Ohio in 2004. And what I've been looking at for since 2018 is how do we get transparent, accurate results as new voting systems are debuting. And this was all before COVID hit, and the shift to voting at home or voting by mail due to the pandemic is one of the biggest changes in voting. And it's going to be a change that's permanent in our political culture. There'll be no going back in years, if not decades. So, and we really need to get a grip on this because it's not the same process as voting in precincts. How big a change? 50 to 60% of the votes that will likely be by mail this fall, but also in upcoming primaries this summer and statewide elections. So in the states that Andrea is focusing on, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, North Carolina, it's been 10% or sometimes less than 5% in 2018. Arizona is different. It was 78%. But east of the Rockies, it's unfamiliar. And there are more steps that people don't know about. So let me just drill down into a couple of these key decision points because you don't see these on the charts that our friends, you know, the Lawyers Committee and others who do voting rights litigation necessarily put out as information on their websites. So yes, of course, you need to be registered to vote, but you also have to have your voter registration information. It has to be up to date because that will affect whether or not you get a ballot delivered. And in most states, this is really crucial. You also have to apply for an absentee ballot. Now, this two-stage process is not widely understood. It's a big deal. It's a barrier. It's like registering twice. And in most states, this is the key thing, you can't do both at once. You cannot register and apply for an absentee ballot at the same time. You cannot update your registration information and apply for an absentee ballot at the same time. And when you take that against the timelines and the schedules that were put into law and rule in the last several decades, long before anything that's happening today was envisioned, you cannot do this at the last minute and get across the finish line. So Andrea, for example, likes to talk a lot about inactive voters and voters who are purged. And yes, it's true. States like Arizona, Missouri, Georgia use bad data and decided not to process lots of registrations at DMVs to delay things. But most of these voters, I'm told by people who are secretaries of state in like places like Oregon and other places, they're voters, they're not inactive. They're voters who moved, but the voter rolls don't reflect that data. So the SIS solution is updating their files, but you can't always do that and apply for an absentee ballot at the same time. This is the current backdrop. Now we're talking about getting the ballots back on time and not necessarily by mail, but there's going to be fewer drop-off places. We're seeing this already. That's because there can be fewer in-person polling places. And now this is really critical. These locations are not necessarily the same. So in Ohio, for example, they didn't want to have any in-person voting in their primary. People showed up and they got provisional ballots, of which tens of thousands were issued, and they haven't even been counted yet. And their primary was April 28th. In Pennsylvania on Tuesday, you cannot turn in an absentee ballot at a local polling place. You have to do it at the county board of election. So people need to know these rules. And so then the other thing is some states also have laws that penalize activists, non-family members who try to help people obtain and turn in ballots. So let me just turn to two other things very, very, very quickly, because these are sort of like the big picture numbers we all need to think about. After everybody goes through all these steps to get registered in the ballots, in hand and turned in, there's some percentage, usually it's around 1% in most states. In Georgia, it was 3% last time, of these ballots get rejected. Now, why is that? It's because the envelopes are not filled out properly on the outside or signatures don't match. And this 1% or more rejection rate can actually be larger than the margins that trigger recounts in many states. So I saw a study last week. In Florida, they're expecting 100,000 ballots to be rejected next fall. That's a big number.
Oh, that's...
And so now, so here's the thing. This is as, Tom and others have said, and Dolores said, this is about education. This is as simple as looking at your driver's license to see how you signed your name and make sure that you sign the same way on the envelope so the images match. There's one other really big number. It's a stunning statistic. It's actually the most shocking thing I have found in looking at all this stuff. And that is this. Experts say that about 10 to 15% of the ballots that are mailed out are not returned. They're not voted. Now, in Wisconsin, in April primary, it was 9.5 or 6%. It was 120,000 ballots that people went through the steps to apply and get them, but they did not send them in. They did not vote. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission, federal agency, combines all these categories of undelivered ballots, spoiled ballots, surrendered at polls. They said 28% of 2018's mailed out ballots were not returned or counted. So, you might think, why would go through all these steps and not vote? But what I'm told by people who run like the largest vote at home nonprofits and former secretaries of state is people get busy. They just don't do it. There's not much research on this. It's across the political spectrum. But one might think possibly there's an organizing opportunity here. If you can connect with people and help them across the finish line, that's a tremendous, so when you hear polls, when you hear other things, forecasts, margins, all this stuff, just think that, on average, 10 to 15% of the ballots that get mailed out are not coming back in. One last thing. I know everyone here is focusing on what to do about the fall, what to do about after this. In the next 90 days, there's going to be 30 or more statewide elections and primaries between now and late August. This is the chance to see who is voting, who isn't, what people are inclined to vote by mail or in person, whether they were being accommodated with all the new infrastructure, where they're being stopped. And this is where you can actually, where there was enough time to count, to cure mistakes, to verify results. I'm told this is the time for activists to pressure state legislatures and governors to either go into special session or do executive orders to change the rules for the fall. In most states, the rules have not been set for pandemic voting. So yes, we've seen some of these excuses lifted and things like that. But but they have not made these decisions about, can ballots be turned in any place? Are there going to be enough places, you know, for in-person voting and all this sort of stuff? So look at, I'll post on the chat here a link to a chart I made of some of these registration application deadlines in these next 90 days. But look to that, because it's not just the fall. What's going to happen in the next 90 days is going to set the stage, and it's not fixed. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm hearing some patterns here. We need more local election sites, not less. Or I'm sorry, voting sites. And then we also need to pay close attention to what's going on with local elections, because that will also set us up for the fall, and that's happening now, not later. And I think, Natasha, if I'm not mistaken, you also mentioned that. So I'm gonna, let's start, let's see, where are we on time? Oh, we're still good on time. Okay. So I will also like to ask you a couple of questions myself. And I was thinking, from a Latino perspective for Tom and for Dolores, who's rejoined us, what do you see as some of the greater challenges we're facing in the Latino community specifically? Because we're also, our communities oftentimes also suffers from voter suppression, but it looks a little bit different. And then a more general question is what exactly should we be looking for in terms of voter suppression? Tom first, then Dolores.
Thanks, Gabby. I think it's quite clear that the Latino community faces challenges created by the fact that we've now had almost 4 years of an administration who seems to focus daily on demonizing the Latino community and on demonizing the immigrant community. That certainly is intended to have an effect to deter participation, civic participation, including voting. Now, that is compounded by the allegations of voter fraud, which we've all discussed have absolutely nothing behind them. But ordinarily, or more often than not, those allegations of voting fraud are directed at the Latino community. Now, those allegations are designed, once again, to deter participation. We have also had voter purge attempts, including one in Texas, a notorious one in Texas last year, that involved using data that the elections administrators, the Secretary of State in Texas, knew to be unreliable. They used DMV data and assumed that anyone who had signed up for a driver's license even many years before and indicated they were not yet a citizen was still not a citizen. In fact, most of the folks who they identified from DMV records as not being citizens had since naturalized, and that's why they were on the voter rolls. So it took litigation by a number of organizations, including MALDEF, to challenge that voter purge and prevent the state of Texas from moving forward with it. But we do often see voter purges that are targeted at naturalized voters, that are targeted at Latino voters. So it's that kind of voter suppression coupled with the deterrence attempts, the attempts to intimidate that we've already talked about that we need to keep an eye on. And of course, as we get closer to an election, those attempts will really dramatically multiply. And as in the past, we have seen with in-person voting, some political forces actually stationing guards in uniforms at polling places where there are lots of Latino voters. And the whole point of that is to scare people away from voting. So we have to do everything in our power to facilitate and encourage participation and to oppose all of these attempts to demonize, deter, and to purge Latino voters.
Dolores.
Oh, thank you very much. Sorry I had to leave so suddenly. We had a power outage, but we were able to get back on. Well, I think some of the voter suppression tactics that they use were mentioned earlier. Here in Kern County, our Democratic congressperson that won in the last election, they actually, they had thrown out many votes because they said that the voter registration signature didn't match, and it was almost 1,000 votes. He barely won by 800 votes. So we had to go on this mad chase to track down people that had voted to bring them in so that they could verify their signatures. And so we know that the other side is going to use any tactic that they can possibly use to, number one, to scare people from the ballot so that they won't vote in the first place. And then using these tactics about, and I don't know how we can possibly do this, but way back when I was working with Howard and Michael Berman, who were like the experts on voting, and they would literally live with the ballots, you know, to make sure that somebody could be there while they were counting the ballots, because it's so easy for them to throw out ballots that are valid and not count them. And so somehow we have to be able to have some kind of a system. So it's not only to be vigilant at the voting site, because we know, again, they will bring people out there and try to discourage people from voting, or
Right.
even we had to chase the sheriffs away and said, we don't want you here because you are actually intimidating voters that might want to come to vote, because they do that often. And so we have to just think of all of this different ways that we can try to counteract this voter suppression that is going on. And the one way that we can somehow drive past the fear of the Latino community is by doing, you know, seeing comedy. How can we do this? We're having, as I mentioned before when I spoke about, we're having this problem with the census, is, you know, getting people to sign up for the census, because they're, and thank you, Tomas, for filing that lawsuit against President Trump, because when we tell people that we actually beat President Trump with the lawsuit that they filed to take the citizenship question off of the census, and that gives people a sense of victory. So we somehow got to break down the fear that people have, because this is what's keeping them back, this intimidation that they feel, and so somehow we have to get through that, especially with the Latino community. Now we know when they do lose that fear, that they can be a very mighty force. We saw this with the Dreamers. So even though these young people were undocumented, that, you know, they had the courage to go out there and do sit-ins, and some of them got arrested. And but because of their work, they were able to get President Obama to do the executive order to give the DACA students, to give them the chance to stay here in the United States. So they gave us an incredible example that we can follow. But it really comes down to doing the work. The work. In our organization, we're organizing people at the neighborhood level. Our grassroots organization is called Vecinos Unidos, Neighbors United. And we're trying to organize them actually neighborhood by neighborhood. We're having to do this anyway on the census, you know. And the other thing, we're tying this into the resources that we're distributing. We recently had a food bank. And again, you know, when people were coming to get food, we would say to them, did you sign up for the census? Have you registered to vote? You know, combining those two very important actions that they have to take at the same time that they're getting their food, and trying to understand that when they're getting the resources, it depends on who they are, whether they're counted, if we're going to get the kind of legislation that we need. And I think before the power went off, I was talking about tying this in with immigration reform, because if we get a new administration and if we have to get a new Congress, then maybe we can finally get some legalization legislation passed that will really cover all of our undocumented members. And so it's really, we have to be tireless, and we just have to organize as many people as we can, and just, you know, build this movement, you might say. And I think the time is now, because we see that people want to do something, they're ready to act, and that's what we have to just talk and talk and talk. And even we have to, as I mentioned before, we have to do this virtually, but we have to do it any which way that we can. And I think that we can make it happen, because we know that the energy is out there right now, the anger is out there, and we just got to tap into that anger and, you know, turn it into a very positive energy and getting people to register to vote. Sí se puede.
Sí se puede. So I'm also hearing from a lot of you that there's a culture piece as well, right? And there's a message piece, and there's a connecting the dots piece. So my next question for Natasha and Phaedra is how are the Legal Defense Fund and Working America, because both of you sort of talked about that, how are you all dealing with that component? Oh, I'm sorry. Either one. Phaedra, you go first. I see your face.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think connecting the dots is the biggest hurdle we have in front of us right now, right? Those of us presumably on this call we're kind of preaching to the choir. We're the ones who are, you know, saying, let's go, let's vote. This is the election, like many of our elections, but this one is highly consequential. I think one of the things we're seeing when we are talking to folks is that we do tracking surveys in the States, and some of the early data that we're getting back for the month of May is that folks are highly concerned about their economic security and the economic recovery in the aftermath of COVID-19. Performing 20 points below that is a concern about the 2020 elections, right? And what that tells me is that there's a huge disconnect, because what we're all saying on this panel is that the way that you change your life circumstances, the way that you recover from this economic system, is to make sure that we're voting in leaders who have our interests in mind. When we rebuild this economy, we've got to make sure that our voices are at the table. And so the steps that we're taking to to make that connection and to connect those dots is to really say, okay, you're saying that you are concerned about healthcare, like universal healthcare is a high priority to you right now. Well, here's how we get there. Your current legislators have all voted against and tried to take away the ACA. So we're not going to get to universal healthcare if we can't even maintain the status quo of what we have. And it's through having those conversations, be it phone, be it text, be it a time when we can go back and talk door to door. We've really got to intricately connect those dots, because right now, folks don't see the election as the resolution to their problems, but they do center their economic concerns front and center. And so we need to help them make those choices through that lens.
Ms. Natasha.
Yes, very similar to Phaedra. I think at the Legal Defense Fund is having these conversations. And as I mentioned, you know, local elections have always been of the utmost importance for the Legal Defense Fund. And so we really do work with our community partners on the ground about the local elections in their states and their counties on a continuous basis, and including right now. I can, you know, and I understand why those dots have to be connected. The Legal Defense Fund also sued Alabama over their photo ID requirement that they put in place shortly, or they started enforcing shortly after Shelby County, and they no longer had to get pre-clearance. And I remember the day after Trump was elected president, we were in Alabama doing a deposition for that case. And, you know, we can hear from our local partners, you know, whether President Trump was elected or versus whether Hillary Clinton was elected, how does that impact me personally day to day in the Black Belt in Alabama? And so we can definitely understand the concern. And that's also why we never forget that local election. So for right now, for example, who are you electing as your DA, your school board committees, your county commissioners, those local people who have such a direct impact on your day-to-day lives. Those elections really matter. And I think people really are able to understand how their school board members, how those people impact them much more, and that the connection may be, you know, the presidential election, like why, you know, whether it's Trump or Hillary Clinton, how is that going to impact me in the Black Belt, where the level of poverty is so extreme and things of that nature. And so I think it really is explaining, just like your local elections, how these local officials impact you, the presidential election also has impact in making that connection and educating voters in that way.
Thank you. So we're getting very close to the end. So I want to do a quick lightning round for you guys. Question from the audience. What is the plan if Trump cancels or postpones the election? We'll start with you, Steve. 1 minute.
Unmute. If he cancels, he's legally not able to cancel. But what can happen is that it's going to take time to count all these absentee ballots. And in that time, you can get all kinds of disinformation, and you can have this prospect of Republican legislatures in sending one slate of electors to Congress and Democratic governors sending another. And then, and a lot of, I've written about this, I won't go into this. It starts this downhill spiral of chaos, and there's very little federal precedent in law to resolve this clearly.
Okay, Natasha, you next. 1 minute.
Yeah, I think Stephen hit it right on the head. Most importantly, you know, the president is not allowed to do that. I agree with Stephen, though. What we're mostly concerned about is the chaos that may be created if you know, we don't have a change of power like so smoothly like we have in the past. I think that's what our, you know, real concern is, if, you know, there's this dissemination of, you know, fake news or, you know, whatever it's going to be called. And, you know, people are called up, or people come to the streets to violently protest what they think of as stealing an election or something of that nature. That's what I think the real concern is. I maybe foolishly am not as concerned about the canceling of an election, because that's not allowed.
Okay, Tom, 1 minute.
I agree, he cannot legally cancel the election. I think the greater danger is that if he tries to resist the outcome of an election, that he has wide support for that resistance. And part of that is built up by his continuing this ongoing notion of voter fraud. He did it last time. He created a voter fraud commission, lasted a very brief period of time before it was ended because they could produce no evidence of fraud whatsoever. He's already starting it again. We need to counter this notion of voter fraud every time it is raised.
Phaedra, your turn.
Well, I'll defer to the legal experts on what can and cannot be done constitutionally, but I will agree that the biggest concern is the misinformation and the chaos that comes from something like that. And I think the role that we can play in that is to really, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but it is having conversations early, building relationships, and cutting through the noise. We at Working America found that when you are seen as a trusted messenger, you are able to cut through the noise. So in 2018, we were able, you know, Trump used migrant caravans as a distraction to in the midterm elections, and we were able to keep our members steadfast on the economic issues that mattered most to them and vote through that lens, and that's what we're going to have to do.
Thank you. Okay, Dolores, wrap us up.
I think we have to assume that they are going to do everything that they can to try to shave votes, suppress votes, steal votes, misinform, cause chaos, etc. We should make a list of all of the things we've talked about today and be prepared to counter each and every action that they are going to take, because they are going to do it. We know this election is going to be so critical, and we have to start informing everybody else, and this is not business as usual. This election that's coming up right now, and it's been said often, it's about the soul of the country, the spirit of the country. This is about the United States of America, and especially as it affects people of color, women, our LGBT community, our kids, etc. So we just have to be prepared. We have to have our weapons in place and start talking right now to everybody that we can. And we have to have such a strong movement, build such a strong wall of defense that they cannot penetrate it, and so that we can win. So we have a few months between now and then, and so we just have to be ready. We have to be ready and be prepared. That's what we can do. You know, one of the tactics that we've used is to get one person to call 10 people that you know. Let's get those messages down, very simple, and get one person to call 10 persons, get those 10 persons to call another 10 people. It's something like the COVID, you know, the way that it escalated so rapidly. You know, they said like 2 people would infect 15 people, 15 people would infect 60 people. Well, let's use the COVID pattern to spread our message of defense and to make sure that, you know, everybody to vote. And even people that are undocumented, either they can't vote, but you know what? They can help get the message out there.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Andrea,
Hey,
are you with us? There you are.
yes, I'm here. My video's turned off, but I'm here. Yes.
So wrap us up.
All righty. All righty. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, try to get my little slideshow to behave from the current slide. There we are. All right. This is where we are now. There are 245 million age-eligible voters in the United States. Right now today, 48 million of those voters are either inactive and or unregistered. And depending upon the state, inactive voters may be able to cast a regular ballot or they may not be. 16.6 million of those voters are either inactive or unregistered. In our 6 states, we represent roughly 9 million of those 6 million voters. Texas alone had 5.1 million deregistered voters, and 3.1 million of them were community of color. Now, what's a voter suppression state look like? We pretty much know, but you can be unregistered for not voting. They have strict photo ID requirements. Remember, older, often rural African Americans couldn't be born in hospitals until the 1970s. So if they never left where they lived for school or to go to work, they may not have the base documents needed to get a photo ID. And now they're in their 70s, 80s, and older. Voter suppression states offer no same-day registration, and they certainly don't have automatic voter registration. What is going to be very, very real in 2020 is that we should expect voter intimidation similar to what we are seeing occur with these peaceful protests. We should expect to see voter intimidation at the polls. So this whole notion of voting by mail and keeping people away from polling places on election day can be a very important tactic. You already saw our postcard designs. I'm going to walk you through a new piece of technology that we've developed. I love what you said, Phaedra, about having meaningful conversations. We do a ton of phone banking. Later on, we are going to be doing text banking. We've designed a whole new tool. It is our tool. It looks different from most texting programs in that you can see the message you're sending. And one of the critical things that we built into our program is 4 of our states, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas, use voting centers. People don't know where voting centers are because they move literally every election. So our tool, if people tell us, no, I'm not going to vote by mail, I'm going to early vote, we can actually look up their early voting centers. And if you look at my slide down on the bottom where it says message that you are about to send, your nearest voting center is, and then it shows the voting center. We have even improved it so that not only does it show the voting center, but because all voting centers in one county are not necessarily open on the same days and or at the same time, we now show the dates that the voting center is open and the times that it's open. If we are doing messages and want to be able to have conversations with people over text, and this has gotten even better, we now show the entire conversation that we have had with the voter, starting from the initial message that was sent to whatever message we're on. And our tool does not require that the person who sent the message be the one to respond, because when we are dealing with voting centers and we are dealing with states that are attempting to suppress the vote, we know that we are going to need some of our most experienced people answering the question. So this tool is set up to allow the people who send and the people to reply to not be the same person. For our younger voters, that 18 to 40-year-old group, the most registered group of people in our entire history, and simultaneously the most non-voting group in our entire history. We are investing in tools, digital tools, where they can check the status of their registration and they can look at setting up their voting plan, and they can put their college on it, and they can bring on their friends, and they get points, and they have the ability to win prizes. I know if you're over the age of 50, you're going, what? This is for 18 to 40-year-olds. You can use it too, because it will show you who and what is on your ballot. But this is really designed for our younger voters. We have no idea if we are going to be having real in-person voting. But we had put together a tool that would allow organizations to dispatch drivers to pick up voters who need a ride. I've been running free rides to the polls since 2017. So we upgraded our software so that it is designed to support multiple days of voting. So we got it. As I said, we knew this could be the election of a lifetime. So our board members and friends stepped up big time. I'm going to skip this and go right to this slide. We are geofencing in Georgia right now for the Georgia primary. We targeted 7 rural predominantly African-American counties, and we're sending the mobile ads. Not this ad exactly, but it's similar. This is what we used last year, where it says our votes decide elections and increase power in our communities. We want our voters to understand you are a critical part in what happens in 2020. Your vote really matters. And for our rural voters, where often we don't have broadband, barely have cell phones, we will be investing in billboards throughout our 6 states. And those billboards will be digital so that when we are in early voting, we can tell voters where they vote, when they vote, what's open. We will also give them where our digital voting guide is. And the whole idea is empower voters with information so that we can cut through the noise. And so, Gabby, I'm going to give it back to you. Oh, there was one more slide I should have shown. We want you to join us. I'm typing it in the chat. You can email rov@peopledemandingaction.org, and we will be happy to get you started sending postcards or making phone calls. Right now, phone calls are going to Georgia. They have an election on June 9th, and then we're going to turn and pivot, and we will be calling Texas because they have an election on July 14th. We don't normally do primary elections, but we're doing this election to see what are they going to throw at us, because we will be ready in November. Gabby, giving it back to you.
Thank you, Andrea. And thank you all for participating in this summit. Before we go, I do want to give a shout out to our super ladies, Suzanne Hutner and Nancy Goodman. They have done everything along with Andrea. I'm just blessed to be able to work with these ladies. And I want to thank all of you, my panelists. You've been incredible. Every time I do something like this, I'm incredibly grateful that we have these amazing advocates who are standing up for all communities, for the vulnerable, and for our families. I mean, what else can you ask for? So thank you all. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Suzanne, Nancy, and Andrea will keep you informed. I can see in the chat you're getting a lot of information. We'll have a lot of it on the website. And with that, please consider donating to us so we can continue doing this amazing work. Centerforcommonground.org. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon. Be safe, everyone. Peace.